This is lecture 8 in the Western intellectual political tradition, and I'm going to call it Plato and Justice, clearings. When we study Plato, we'll be using the Republic, as touching on Gorgias, reflecting a bit on the Laws and some of Plato's other works. But one of the key elements in Plato's thinking, as in Greek thought itself, when it came to politics and the polis, or the city-state, and how people are to live together meaningfully, was how is that to be done intellectually in terms of sorting out the best way that is to be understood, and then how is it to be embodied in fact and in deed. And one of the key elements in Plato's thinking, as in Aristotle, as in any thoughtful person who's trying to grapple with the intellectual and practical nature of how politics or the polis should be lived, was the question of justice. Now, because I'm calling this lecture Clearings, I want to clear away a few things that Plato would not have understood to be justice, which we tend to use the language of justice today in a way that the classical world would certainly not think of it in those terms. So the first thing today when we hear justice, we think of the justice system, or crime and punishment in that sense. And so justice is restricted and reduced to the issue of criminology and programs in criminology and what one does with the criminal who breaks the law. And so the issues then become retributive justice, restorative justice, rehabilitative justice, transformative justice. And so justice is then very, very much a word that becomes a plaything of the criminal system and how one is treated when they have broken the law or engaged in a variety of activities in which others have been hurt and harmed, including themselves, by what they've done. So justice then means something, but or the Justice Institute, for example, in the Lower Mainland. So that's one way of understanding justice, which is a branch of the bigger philosophical understanding of justice, but it's not the trunk on the tree or the roots of how classical thinking would use it. The other would be, so if the first would be sort of Dostoevsky's crime and punishment and justice and the motivations why people do what they do, and then the actions that come from the motivations, and then where police fit in, where criminology fits in. This is one understanding of justice. The second would be the injustices at an economic level between those who are wealthy and those who live, say, in the first world and those in the third world, or wealth and poverty in the first world or in the third world, or in developing and developed nations. So it's like Dickens' Tale of Two Cities in that sense. So then to be just in that sense is to overcome the obviously inequities and inequalities of poverty, of suffering that comes with poverty, inadequate income, minimum wage for people, working conditions, the role of unions in all of this in creating some form of justice for working class people versus the managerial or the captains of industry in that sense. So justice then becomes very, very linked to economic conditions, and this is where, for example, certainly with the rise of 19th century thinking on economics from Karl Marx and those who followed in his train, justice and economics is a key element in understanding justice. And again, Plato and the classical tradition would certainly be concerned with how economics and wealth is distributed or not distributed, and where that leads to people who either profit at one level or those who are the victims of economic injustices, either by birth or by situations, or who were slaves in the wars. And so that's another understanding of justice which is based on largely clash between city-states, economic issues, and then those who do well and those who do not know well, and those who do not know well, from the Spartacus tradition forward, cries for justice, which is really a cry for some sort of economic equity, an attempt to move forward up the economic ladder and to some degree create at least equalities of opportunities, because many are not born in equality of condition, and to some degree in our present situation equality of outcome, which is even much more difficult to guarantee. The third one, which is very much before us today, are the social justice warriors, who again, using the language of justice, coming from a certain understanding of the powerful, the oppressed, those who are suffering from systemic racism, systemic powerlessness traditions. And so the street activism, they're calling forth justice, or police treatment of people on the streets, or whites and colored. I mean, there's various ways of looking at the social justice warriors of the progressive left, and in many ways the legitimacy of their deeper concerns, and yet some of the ways they're working out those concerns are problematic in the way they're interpreting sometimes history and contemporary events, while recognizing their intentions, and some of the issues they're addressing are certainly legitimate and needful. But justice, again, is used here. So social justice warriors, and of course the questions they're raising would very much interest a Plato, and Aristotle, a Pericles, and Demosthenes, many of these people. So those are certainly three areas in which we hear the language of justice tossed around like a frisbee in our time, and people then assume that's what justice means or how it should be addressed. So the sort of the criminology one then that we find justice dominates. The economic issue, which also is essential in the discussion, which Plato and Aristotle will be very concerned about. And then the social justice warriors, that we've certainly been fixated on their concerns in daily news in different parts, significantly in the United States more than most places, but certainly playing itself out in other parts of the world, Canada, and but we've certainly experienced the treatment of blacks and what has been seen as police brutality, and then lowering the whole in terms of the money going into funding policing, given what police have done in certain parts of the United States, and then the reaction, social justice warriors. So justice there once again. So those three areas in which the language of justice is used, and how would a Plato, an Aristotle, how would a classical understanding of justice articulate, make sense of, engage these different streams, or what we call branches of justice on the bigger trunk of the justice tree. Might also say, when many people turn to Plato, particularly coming from an Aristotelian or a liberal democratic tradition, certainly emerging post-Reformation and then moving into the 19th, 20th centuries in democracy, the rule of the people, the demos, kratia demos, the rule of the people. Plato, for example, would have his concerns would very, very much be the relationship of truth to the rule of democracy, and where does that lead. But particularly in the emerging liberal democratic tradition, many on the right, the political right, have tended to see Plato as the pioneer, the articulator of a totalitarian form of government. And these are usually misreads of the Republic, misreads of the laws. But you get a whole tradition from the political right, Karl Popper, Hayek, to some degree, Vogelin, and there are Mitt Friedman. They see this highly structured and organized understanding of the polis that Plato articulates within the Republic. And there's far more, of course, to Plato than the Republic, but most people will focus in on just this keyword, which we'll be looking at this semester, and hopefully we'll be doing a little deeper dives and nuancing some of this. But the political right as often when they compare and contrast Plato, Aristotle, they see Plato as the forerunner of some variation of authoritarianism or totalitarianism, and Aristotle much softer and a little more receptive to democratic traditions. And so then Plato is dismissed as someone, why would you study someone like that other than as a reason to move in a direction which leads to injustice, and arguing that Plato's whole way of thinking, even though claiming in the Republic to be engaged with justice, actually leads to immense injustice and inequalities. And so Plato is often dismissed, as I mentioned, then from people on the right by the way they interpret him. And so as we go through the Republic in this class, hopefully we will come to see that Plato, in his varied works, cannot be reduced to some sort of totalitarian or authoritarian explanation which anticipates certain forms of Marxism. They do much the same thing, of course, with Thomas More's Utopia, a very important 16th century work, who More dedicates to Plato. And so More's Republic, Utopia, and then Plato's Republic, many on the right see these are recipes for communism and socialism and distribution of wealth in a certain way that inhibits the free play of the individual in the marketplace of economics, of ideas, and many of these other things. So Plato is often dismissed by the political right as well as someone who, in his careful thinking and the various books in the Republic, and as I said, Thomas More is picking up on Utopia and dedicating his work to Plato, as those who anticipate communism, socialism, greater state involvement. And so is this what Plato is all about? Well, obviously not. There's much more to Plato than that in what he's getting at, and the Republic is a portal into that discussion. And so some of these things that have to be cleared in terms of actually getting to Plato and what he's trying to articulate in terms of how a just city-state should be organized. Just one thing I'll mention, which Plato will raise in the Republic, which would be his questioning of democracy in that sense, would be, he'll use the analogy of various professions in which he tries to think through what's the difference between aristocracy, meritocracy, democracy, these various political traditions, or plutocracy, and why does he feel aristocracy? Remember, as in previous lectures, when he talks aristocracy, he's not talking about landed class, he's talking about a quality of leader who embodies the virtues, is very wary of the vices, who has the character and the skills, not just the skills, meritocracy, but more importantly, he's rooted in a certain character of what it means to rule, the arete, and then those with the skills then carry forth that way of thinking. For Plato, there were layers of society, those who should rule, those who have skills to implement the ruling, and based on temperament and training, the roles they then play into what Plato will use, as St. Paul will pick on the image later, the body. So the body politic, so just as the body, there's arms, there's fingers, there's legs, there's hands, there's hearts, there's heads. So who are the women and men who are the head, the heart, the shoulders, the hands, the feet, all of these sorts of things. So we know, for example, if we want to have our teeth fixed, we just don't bring anyone into the dentist's office to play the role of the dentist, and we go and expect them to fix our teeth. There are men and women who are trained as dentists, and they're the ones we trust to fix our teeth when there's cavities or whatever has to be done. They're experts in a field, people who've got the training, and then they're the ones we go to. If you want open heart surgery, you don't bring a bunch of people in a room with no training and say, well, just vote one person or another will do the open heart surgery. We have women and men who are trained to do it. They've spent years learning about the body, learning about neurobiology, learning about how various aspects of the body works, and so to bring some sort of healing and health, you go to someone who's an expert in an area. So Plato, one of his questions and his concerns, and there's many analogies, you don't have someone to come in and do your plumbing who has no background whatsoever, or an electrician, you have someone who's got some training. We bring people in. Now, the problem of a democracy, in terms of how voting is done, is that a person can come with no skills whatsoever, and because they are voted in, they're the ones who represent a people in a riding, in an area, at the highest levels of power. Now, no other areas of life of significance do we apply that, but somehow in politics, and this concerned Plato, because you would never in most spheres of life have people with no training whatsoever. Would you trust them in terms of plumbing, electrician, doctor, dentist? You expect people with some training. So part of the Republic is Plato's trying to get a sense of, if in most spheres of life, analogically, you have women and men who have skills, they have training, and then best case scenario, they have the character to rule. For Plato, why in politics, which is far more important than these lesser skills, even though they're necessary, but in terms of the sufficient running of the polis or the city-state, why would we not equally have women and men who have the ability, trusting their character in terms of their wisdom, in terms of their longing for justice, their courage, what would be articulated as the classical virtues in that sense? Why would not they be the ones who rule? And it's not a matter of voting, because often in a voting tradition, you can get people who come into power which have no background whatsoever in ruling in a broad way, even though they're skilled in a way that, in terms of a profession, equips them to do well, but that's quite different than ruling in the polis. So for Plato, in trying to make sense of how should a polis be run, who are the women and men that should do that, what is the analogy we would use in the actual parapolitical way of life, in which people have training, hopefully they're women and men of character, but so what is the criteria that should be in place for the rulers, or the arete in that sense? And so Plato is very suspicious, even more so than Aristotle, even though Aristotle's suspicious as well, of a democracy. But they're also equally suspicious of a meritocracy and a plutocracy. Plutocracy comes, of course, from Pluto, the god of the underworld, the one who thought of wealth and wealth. For Plato, those who only think of money, just like the Midas touch, certainly should not be people who are ruling if they only think of the ledger of profit and loss as the means of making decisions. For them, people like that, they become moral cripples from Plato's perspective. So plutocracy, which we have a lot today around, particularly women and men, and the rise of wealth and the concentration of wealth, these would be kept at a distance by Plato and certainly be not a part of the aristocracy, the arete, the women and men who rule. And also meritocracy, just because a person is very gifted in doing very well in a certain area of their profession, either economically or medical profession or many other professions, does not mean they are women and men of character, which is what arete is about. And for Plato, it is women and men of character that are the head, the brains, and then who are the ones who are the shoulders, the arms, who are the heart, who are the legs. And that comes from the notion of physis, a person's nature, which of course is not something frozen. And in that sense, Plato would be very suspicious of a certain type of classism that freezes a person's potential based on their birth. And if a person is born in a lower class or a middle class, does that mean they are restricted and frozen into that class throughout their life? For Plato, it would be no. In fact, their nature, and that's what education, good teachers are meant to draw out what a person's nature is and where they fit into the body politic. So the clearings, in that sense, before we get to Plato, very important to understand the notion of justice for him is not the crime and punishment approach. It's not the economic approach. It's not social justice warriors. He's certainly not an apologist for totalitarianism or authoritarianism. His notion of justice has a lot to do with what is fit and right for different temperaments given their nature as it unfolds, and how do they fit into the body politic, again using, as I mentioned, the body as an analogy for the body politic itself. These discussions we'll look into a little more as then we move into the Republic, the Gorgias, and some of his other works that deal with politics and justice. So these few comments are really meant to be clearings that get us out of the forest of often misreads and misunderstandings of Plato and open up the way where we can get a much better perspective in a clear and a fuller way what Plato constructively and positively was attempting to do.